Hello again. Continuing on with the December issue of Psychology Today articles, there was an interesting one in there as well that caught my attention on pronoun usage, essentially, and it has a lot written from a linguist talking about use of pronouns specifically. It doesn't get super specific on exact situations, but the main one it focuses on is in the workplace, someone going from he to they as a pronoun change, and how that shift can happen and what it looks like linguistically for people, which also includes mental and cognitive aspects too. Changing language affects your mind cognitively. There's a lot of, I say there's a lot of, and then I blank immediately. But games that kids play, like Pig Latin is one, and things like that, where you intentionally try to change letters and words, and your brain can do it. It's just a challenge and a shift to think differently, and then you usually get into a flow of doing it. And I would argue that's part of their argument here, is that we'll just get used to it. And they make a point about language use over time, specifically with pronouns, and a reference to Chaucer in the 14th century using they as a singular pronoun. And they don't bring it up here, but as I understand, you have Roman and Greek culture that got more into gender fluidity, and I don't know for sure about pronoun usage, but that how a lot of our society looks today with approaching gender happened then. I know we talk about it as a postmodern thing, which fine, but it's not new at all. This has been a thing for a very, very long time in different societies. So no, this isn't a new issue. Whether it's a helpful or hurtful issue, that's debatable, but the newness of it, not really. It's just back into that flow where we're going. And so the linguistic perspective is fascinating to me. I always have loved language and understanding linguistics and studying how we talk and how we use words. It's very fun to me. So I like reading an article like this. It does do a good job of just kind of focusing in on how we've shifted words. And a very common cultural one is using he as a general pronoun for groups of people. We've also used it for, they don't bring it up here, but you'll often say that with like animals. I've heard that, not even animals, insects, as a reference before. Like you swat a fly and you said, I got him, I got him. Like you don't know the fly's gender, you just say that. So how we'll loosely use them to just mean either groups or singular. Spanish does that a lot, using a masculine ending for words to describe groups of people, and specifically groups where there's at least one man, which is another topic. But the second part of this article, which I think I would have a little bit more dialogue about, is talking about the connection with gender usage and identity. And they're arguing there that the importance of using the right pronouns is more about connecting with identity, which I've heard that before. I think most people would understand that perspective, especially at this point. That's a big point for them. They even bring up like naming, like when we have a name that we're being called and telling someone this is my name, and they call you something different. That's an attack on identity. And they make a strong statement that says when someone else tells you who you are, they're taking all your power away, and they're essentially erasing you. It goes on to end that not using someone's preferred pronoun is more or less an insult. They use the phrasing a grave insult, and I would say this is definitely more complicated than this, and people tend to argue that a lot. And the issue really for a lot of people isn't around pronoun usage so much as it is around truth and identity. And I think that's where, if you look at this as a two-sided argument, where people really get mixed up about this, is a lot of maybe more right-leaning people are viewing this as, these are just people living in a fairy tale land, and they're trying to make things up and tell all of us how to speak and how to talk, and they're denying truth. That's an argument there, and a lot of people on the left are arguing this is just our identity. It's how we identify, it's how we see ourselves, it's how we feel, and we're asking for something as simple as just respecting that. And I think both are reasonable and also not quite encompassing of the full argument, particularly being able to understand both sides there. And people have very different views of what identity is. So I lean towards identity being a very strong rooted thing in a person, we don't decide that at all. It just is what it is. That's why we have different desires. That's why we have different things that engage us. When I've talked before in these videos about values being a big deal, that's part of the work that I do. So some people really value honesty, they value kindness, or they value nature, or they value spirituality, and these things that really draw them to something. We don't really pick that. That's very much what we are drawn to as people. Can that be stewarded or hindered by different people around us? Yes, it can. But we have these things that are just inherent in us. And so identity to me is that. It's not something that we just choose and pick. Now, the discovery piece, which is a lot of what people talk about when they're talking about identity and pronoun use, there's this discovering, which is why sometimes people will change pronouns multiple times. We're discovering who we are and who our identity is. That's a very, very real thing. I just sit in a camp that says we're not going to change that. Discovering it's different, in the same sense that, if I go to a restaurant and I say, oh, I discovered this restaurant. It's like I've learned that it's there. It's always been there, so to speak. Or just because I found it doesn't mean it's now there magically. It was there. I've just been looking for it and discovering it. No, comparing gender identity to restaurants is not the most appropriate metaphor, but I think people understand what I'm going for with that. So it's interesting, and every time I see an article, it's always very strong on like this one. This erases someone's sense of self. This erases their identity. This insults them gravely. Or it's on the other side where it's saying these people are crazy. These people are delusional. That's just not fair to either side of the conversation. It's more complicated. Is that fair in some situations because that's what people are saying? Yeah, that is fair to individual people, but as the overall conversation goes, the understanding of it is complicated. Even if you think that this is a simple topic, it isn't, and that's why it's a fired up topic. If it was that simple, it wouldn't be that fired up. And then, of course, politics helps us to go mad with these things and what they mean. So I think this stuff's worth reading. And if anyone reads any article or watches any video on gender identity, whether it's a for that side or not, which at the moment is a left-leaning versus right-leaning issue in many cases, if you can't sit through and hear the perspectives without getting enraged, then this is way more emotional for you than it is understanding and logical. And yes, you can get emotional, especially when this affects you directly, but we have to be able to understand where people are getting stumped on the understanding piece, and we have to understand why people on the other side are wanting this to be heard and understood a certain way. These things matter. So very short article, but room for a lot of conversation. So yeah, I don't have a follow-up for that. Just an interesting one. I love the linguistic side, the oversimplification of the viewpoint on the second half. Not as much. It's complicated, but I like that both are present with this, so just want to talk about that.